I have been looking forward to today's review. I'm a bit of a cynical watch enthusiast, and I know that even one's most beloved watches can eventually fade into indifference and just end up sitting in the box, days and years on end. I'm also seasoned enough to never say never, but let's just say it's highly unlikely that I will ever part with this Girard-Perregaux 2598, also known as the Vintage 1960. It's a hidden gem of watch design that I've had the pleasure of owning for 5 months now, and it has become my daily wearer. Let's have a closer look. What is this thing? Well, it's clearly related to classic field watches. We have a supremely legible black and white dial that takes at least some of its cues from watches like the Dirty Dozen World War II watches. We have Arabic numerals, we have simple subdials, and we have the railway track minute scale. And generally a clean and simple design where form very much follows function. This is clearly a utilitarian piece. But then there's that cushion case. That's certainly not very field watchy. It's more Panerai Lumino. But then again, it's not. The cushion is more pronounced on the GP, with the flat part of the cushion being level with the dial, where Panerai slope. We also have a little edge on each corner, and the lugs on the GP merge seamlessly with the rest of the case, very much unlike Panerai. If we turn the watch to the side, you can see how dramatically the lugs slope. I usually tend to smile a little when people talk about comfortable watches. I mean, we're talking about watches and not shoes, and in my experience there's only so much variety in the quote-unquote comfort level of a wristwatch. But this watch is the exception that confirms my home-baked rule. My 17cm circumference wrist just slips into it like a favorite plush sock. It's not just that there's an absence of discomfort when wearing it. Somehow it actually adds comfort to how my wrist feels. It's like the lugs are hugging you. It's weird. I want to draw your attention to the flow of the various parts of the whole. This is a 38mm watch, which is not big by modern standards. I bought it on a bit of a whim, and I thought 38 was a little on the small side, which almost made me not buy it. But because of the cushion case, it wears more like a 39 or even a 40. At the same time, the lug space is 21mm, which is big for a watch this size. The 42mm Omega Speedmaster has a lug space of just 20, and so does the 43mm Sin 156 that I reviewed recently. I'll paste a link in below. Because we have a lug width to case width ratio of more than 1:2, the strap blends into the case shape to a higher degree than what we usually see. This is then accentuated by the cushion shape and the integrated lugs. So instead of a round disc held in place by a very distinct rectangular strap, which is what most watches look like, here we have a more harmonious flow that I have not seen on any other watch. It's like the edge of the strap naturally and gently sweeps out to the side and morphs into the watch, and then gently returns to being a strap on the other side. It's really quite unique. Back to the size for a minute. Most men's watches sold today will be between 39 and 42mm wide, so the 2598 is actually slightly off this scale at the lowest end, while the Omega Speedmaster, which we have here, is at the high end with its 42mm. But look at how they present themselves visually. While the Speedmaster is clearly a bigger watch, you wouldn't think we were at either end of the spectrum. Part of this has to do with the lug-to-lug distance, which is 49.2mm on the GP and just 48mm on the Speedmaster, despite this clearly being a bigger watch. While I personally like short lugs on most watches, on the GP 2598, the longer lugs are part of what makes this design so pleasing and harmonious. Alright, that was a lot of talk about how this thing looks, but we haven't even gotten to the best part yet, how it works. As you will probably have guessed by the two buttons, this is a chronograph, but the two subdials have nothing to do with that chronograph. But before we get into the details of that, let's take a 15-second break while I present StockPad, which is a project I'm involved in. StockPad makes it easy to keep a stock watch list with your own notes and to save articles, all in a user-friendly interface. StockPad keeps track of changes in price and makes it simple to sort and find your notes. And it's free. Good luck with your investments. Unusually, the subdials on the Girard-Perregaux 2598 do not display any information relevant for the chronograph. On the right, you have the running seconds, and on the left, the 24-hour time. This is probably the only hint of nonsense I can find of this watch, as a 24-hour time isn't really all that useful, and I would rather have seen a power reserve here, despite this being an automatic watch. Some may think that a power reserve only belongs on a manual watch so the user can see when to wind it, but an automatic watch might have been put on the desk or by the bed for a day or so, and it's useful to see if it needs a little moving around to continue its onward march. Anyway, I digress. The two subdials are wonderfully symmetrical and both have railway tracks like the main dial. It's very harmonious, but not needed for the chronograph. So how does a chronograph work? Well, let's get it started. As you can see, there are two hands up here. The chronograph seconds are now running, and behind it is the chronograph minute hand. You will see this thing moving along now as the chronograph seconds tick along. This is just like on the well-known Lemania 5100 movement that is no longer produced, and like Sin's EZ01 movement, which is a modded Valjoux 7750. The chronograph minute hand is not in a subdial, but is this red-tipped hand on the main dial. This is the only splash of color on the otherwise black and white dial, and it's just beautiful. An almost aesthetic design approach that still somehow feels sophisticated. Observe also how thin the chronograph hands are, but how, despite of this, legible they are. Having a central minute hand for the chronograph is quite unusual. There are very few movements around that do things this way. At the heart of this GP is an ETA 2892-A2, which is used by numerous watch brands, such as Longines, Rado, Sin, and Panerai. If you've jumped onto the whole in-house movement bandwagon, you may sniff at an ETA movement in a high-end Swiss watch. But this is of course the chronometer-grade variety, and after a brief visit to my local watchmaker, this is now precise to within about 1.5 seconds a day. Not bad for a 22-year-old watch. It's well within both COSC and today's meter standards. And an ETA movement is always easy and relatively cheap to have serviced, so I'm a fan. Besides, the whole in-house movement thing is a long story with a lot of marketing guff. I'll get back to that in another video. My watchmaker also sent me this picture of the watch with the case opened. You can see we have rhodium plating, Genève embellishments and blued screws. This is proper craftsmanship. Now, the ETA 2892 does not have a chronograph, of course. In this GP, this is provided by a Dubois-Duprat module that is combined with the main movement. This is what gives us the unusual but supremely useful complication of a central minute hand for the chronograph. It's much easier to read than in a small subdial, and it's visually interesting. This does mean that we need to stack 4 hands onto the canyon pinion, but the watch still has a relatively modest thickness of 13.7 millimeters. Pretty good. In total, the movement has 44 joules, so there's a lot going on in here. Now, we're clearly missing an hour hand for the chronograph, and you could argue that this should have been put in the 9 o'clock subdial instead of the 24-hour time. But I'd argue that it is very rare indeed that you would need to count hours using your chronograph, or that you would be in doubt of whether you had run your marathon in 2 hours 20 or 3 hours 20. The movement beats at 4 Hz or 28,800 vibrations per hour, and it has hacking seconds, so the seconds hands stop when you pull out the crown and you can accurately set the watch. It's an astounding little piece this, and a little bonus information at the end. The GP 2598 was also called the Vintage 1960, as you can see on the case back here. Now, later in the production cycle, someone must have thought that the watch was more a child of the 1970s than of the 60s, so it was renamed Vintage 1970 while retaining its model number 2598. It's a little confusing, but hey. It also came in a cream dial version that I'm not nearly as fond of. My research indicates that the watch was produced from 1999 to 2006, and that only 1,900 pieces of this black version were made in total, but I have not been able to verify this. However, the relative rarity of these coming up for sale would indicate that this could be true. On Chrono24, there is one for sale at the time of recording this, and that's quite typical. Sometimes there won't be any for a few months. The best part, these are relatively cheap, at least for now. Girard-Perregaux is in the upper tier of Swiss watchmaking. Some would put them just below the likes of Patek Philippe, but certainly above, say, Omega or Rolex in terms of craftsmanship and attention to detail. On top of that, this is a relatively rare model with a rather unique complication that is wonderfully harmonious in its design. No nonsense and elegant at the same time. You could wear this to war or to dinner at the Queen's. Still, this watch can be found for less than €3,000 in very good condition. I paid a little bit less for this one, which is almost in mint condition, despite not having been polished from the looks of it. That's it. The Girard-Perregaux 2598 vintage 1960 or 70. A real gem in the semi-vintage watch world that I intend to hold on to. Let's check out the no-nonsense meter, and yes, we are going high.